There is floating around a bewildering mass of false ideas, which blind the vision of all parties. Jose Ortega y Gasset, The Revolt of the Masses. I try to spend a good deal of my time searching out and correcting blind spots in our thinking, our language, and our history. And over the last couple of years, I've been thinking about how we can possibly correct the major problem plaguing society today. And that problem is, of course, the deep-rooted corruption that I tend to point out in most of my videos. And over the last couple of years, I've come up with two potential solutions. In this video, I'm going to be discussing one of those solutions. And that solution is tyranny. That's right. Despite what you've been programmed to believe, one of the only solutions to this problem is in fact a tyrant. And this is something that you might have to think about for a little bit, but just think about this. The club has corrupted every aspect of our society. The courts, the media, practically all of the politicians, both in the states and the federal government, and even the average person has had their mind corrupted by our corrupt education system, the corrupt media, and the many corrupt role models and shills who are willing to sell out their fellow human being to power-hungry madmen and women for material riches. So when you take all of this into account, you have to ask yourself, how can we rely on a deeply corrupted system to undo this corruption? Maybe you can attempt to educate people on what's right and what's wrong. You can go around and try to spread awareness, sort of like what Socrates was attempting to do in ancient Greece. But for every 4 people you educate, 100 more uneducated people will be created. And of course, there's a lot more else I can say about this. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at what I thought about right after coming up with this idea. You see, right after coming up with this idea, I immediately thought about Plato's 5 regimes, also known as Plato's degenerating regimes. Now, for those of you who don't know this, according to Plato, societies start as aristocracies, and then the aristocracies degenerate into timocracies, and then timocracies degenerate into oligarchies, and then oligarchies, of course, degenerate into democracies, and then democracies, according to Plato, inevitably degenerate into tyranny. Now, when I thought about Plato's 5 degenerating regimes, I had a moment of shame, because I have to admit that I was only loosely familiar with this idea of Plato's 5 regimes. So I decided to buy the book in which Plato presented this idea, which is The Republic. And after reading it, I realized that Plato, he appears to be spreading a certain flavor of propaganda. And I'll be getting into that probably later on in this video. So before I get into my theory as to why a tyrant is necessary to fix our current problem, I'd like to go over and correct what Plato has to say. Or at least I'd like to go over the reasons that Plato gave for why democracies eventually become tyrannies. So I'm going to use what Wikipedia has to say about the 5 regimes because the Wikipedia page does a pretty good job at summarizing Plato's points. If I go and I take what is found in the Republic, I'll have to take a bunch of pictures, then send those pictures to my computer, and then even those sentences, I'll have to sort of summarize them or paraphrase them. So to save myself the hassle, I'm just going to stick to what is found on Wikipedia. So let's begin by looking at what Plato says about aristocracies. So according to Plato, all societies start as aristocracies, and he's right about that. But the aristocratic society that he describes is it's a complete fantasy. Or more accurately, like I said, it's very likely the propaganda that one would expect to find in an aristocratic society. It appears like Plato is. I don't know if he's doing it intentionally. I don't know if he was aware that what he was espousing was propaganda. But it appears like he was basically just regurgitating propaganda in a very mindless manner. So let's see what Wikipedia says about Plato's aristocracy. Aristocracy is the form of government advocated in Plato's Republic. This regime is ruled by a philosopher king, and thus is grounded on wisdom and reason. The aristocratic state, and the man whose nature corresponds to it, are the objects of Plato's analysis throughout much of the Republic's books, as opposed to the other four types of states/men that are studied primarily in Book 8. The aristocratic state that Plato idealizes is composed of three caste-like parts: the ruling class, made up of the aforementioned philosopher kings, who are otherwise identified as having souls of gold; the auxiliaries of the ruling caste, made up of soldiers, whose souls are made up of silver, and whose job in the state is to force on the majority the order established by the philosophers; and the majority of the people, souls of either bronze or iron, who, in contrast to the first two classes, are allowed to own property and produce goods for themselves, but are also obliged to sustain with their own activities their rulers, who are forbidden from owning property in order to preclude that the policies they undertake be tainted by personal interest. Before I move on, let me just explain what's really going on here. Because of course this sounds all grand, and Plato of course makes it sound like the perfect society. But it's actually a giant con. These are just confidence men who were confidently telling the people that, yeah, we're forbidden from owning property, and you guys get to own property. No, that's not what happens. All of the property is technically, if you really think about it, the state's property. And what happens is, you have a group of aristocrats. Now, aristocrats, actually, you know what, let me take this over to a quote. I'm going to deviate from my original plan, and I'll just explain it as I go along, instead of waiting until I get to the end of the video. In order to understand what's really going on in this aristocratic state, we have to look at what Jose Ortega y Gasset, which is in my opinion the greatest philosopher of all time, we have to see what this man said about societies. He says, "I have never said that human society ought to be aristocratic, but a great deal more than that. What I have said, and still believe with ever-increasing conviction, is that human society is always aristocratic by its very essence, to the extreme that it is a society in the measure that it is aristocratic, and ceases to be such when it ceases to be aristocratic. Of course, I am speaking now of society and not of the state." Now, when he's talking about aristocratic here, you have to look up the definition of aristocratic. And if you just use Google, you're not going to get the correct definition. The Google definition is just a single definition of belonging to or typical of the aristocracy, an aristocratic family. Now, the actual definition that Jose Ortega is using here is the definition number 3 here, which can be found on, I think this is the Merriam Online Dictionary. And the third definition here is notably superior or excellent. So human society, when it's created by notably superior and excellent human beings. It's created by people who have certain excellent qualities to them. At the beginning of a society, have people who have certain excellent qualities to them. They know certain trades or certain skills. They're capable of farming, they're capable of metallurgy, they're capable of certain excellent things. However, they still require help. These aristocrats cannot create a whole society by themselves. So in order to get help, they invite outsiders. And they invite outsiders with these conditions here. What they do is they tell these outsiders, hey, come to our society, come over here, and we'll educate you, we'll teach you to be great like us. You can be aristocrats just like us, or at least you can come close to it. Now, of course, in early societies, these aristocrats, well, let me not get ahead of myself. Let me first state, in Plato's time, by the time that Plato was speaking this stuff, society, human civilizations, had actually gone through all 5 regime types. And this is what Plato doesn't really fully realize, is that what he's doing here is he's espousing, kind of late propaganda, if you think about it historically. Because the first set of aristocrats, they actually conquered not by having, excellent qualities, but essentially they were great astronomers. Early civilizations, these very beginning aristocracies with these very early philosopher kings who became pharaohs or who were pharaohs, they came into power because they were aware of astronomy. They had an excellent understanding of astronomy, and they used their understanding of astronomy to convince people that they were gods. So by the time Plato came around, they had to change their game up from being gods to then being philosopher kings who were all wise and stuff. But anyway, I'm sorry, I was supposed to discuss this later on in the video. Let me get back to the point that I was trying to make here with this stuff. So these philosopher kings, or these aristocrats, they have other excellent qualities too, like being able to farm, capable of metallurgy, also just knowing how to set up and plan out a society, and knowing how to manipulate people's minds. So anyway, what they do to attract outsiders is they tell those outsiders this nonsense. They're all like, oh yes, you majority, you guys can own the property with scare quotes, because they don't actually own it, because technically these philosopher kings at any time can take that property from them, or they can even just change the Constitution up where they can take that property from them. This is all just propaganda. These philosopher kings, this is what they tell the people to lure them in, to sucker them in to basically being their slaves. Because, check this out, remember, the people, the majority, have to sustain the leaders with their own activities. So this is part of the whole con. And this is actually what's going on here in this aristocracy that Plato was worshipping. Now, I really want to focus on, though, how the tyrant comes around. Now, I'll go on to look at what Plato said about the aristocratic man. It's sort of important, so let's read it. So the aristocratic man is better represented by Plato's brand of philosopher, a man whose character and ambitions have been forged into those ideal for a just ruler through a rigorous education system designed to train intellectuals that are selfless and upright, and whose souls have been made calm and aware of the absolute good by learning the truth based on the Platonic ideas. Plato envisages for this philosopher a disposition and ability that makes him the ideal governor of any state precisely because his soul knows the idea of the good, which is the metaphysical origin of all that is good, including happiness itself. Wealth, fame, and power are just shadows of the good and provide only hollow and fleeting satisfaction. It is only the knowledge of the good in itself that gives man enduring and real happiness. Thus, the philosopher who is exposed to metaphysical contemplation is not tempted to abuse his power in his pursuit of material goods, and his state policies are therefore dedicated to establishing only the good in the state, not his personal interest. In contrast to historical aristocracies, Plato's resembles a meritocracy or proto-technocracy of sorts. In it, a big government state keeps track of the innate character and natural skills of the citizens' children, directing them to the education that best suits those traits. In this manner, a child with a gold soul born to parents with silver, bronze, or iron souls will not be held back by his inferior birth and will be educated to the levels above his kin according to his golden qualities. Conversely, from parents with gold and silver souls, a child born with a bronze or iron soul is educated to only the level earned by his natural aptitude. Okay, so this is all, once again, all of the propaganda to lure people in and to make them accept being ruled by these philosopher kings. And this is something that Plato did. This was a point of Plato's where he was like, oh yeah, in this society, if your child is born to a bronze family, which is the majority, it's basically the peasant class. If your child is born into a bronze family, or born to somebody who has a bronze soul, and your child has a gold soul, then they'll be educated to be leaders. This is all just social mobility propaganda. It's this promise of, hey, come to our society. Come over here, be our slaves, basically, and your kids might have a chance to become leaders or to become philosopher kings. And this con is very evident when you look at the reasons that Plato gives for why these societies degenerate. So let's check this out. Let's look at timocracy. So timocracy is treated in Book 8 of the Republic on these pages. Aristocracy degenerates into timocracy when, due to miscalculation on the part of its governing class, the next generation of guardians and auxiliaries includes persons of an inferior nature. The persons with souls made of iron or bronze, as opposed to the ideal guardians and auxiliaries, who have souls made of gold and silver. Since in the government there will be present people of an inferior nature, inclined not just to cultivating virtues but also producing wealth, a change in the constitution of the aristocratic city is eventually worked, and its educational system, which used to introduce the high classes into a purely rational, selfless political theory, is altered so that it becomes permissible for current state leaders to pursue their individual interest. The timocracy, however, does not completely break from all the characteristics of aristocracy, and for Plato, this regime is a combination of good and bad features. Alright, one of the first things that I want to say about this timocracy is that aristocracies don't become timocracies simply because of a miscalculation on the part of its governing class. They become timocracies for a couple of reasons. One reason that they become timocracies is in order to fix the problems the general public starts to have with the aristocracies. Namely, the problem that a small group tells the majority how to live. Like in aristocracies, you have this very small group of philosopher kings who are basically living a life of leisure. They don't have to work or do anything. All they have to do is like the political stuff, and then everyone else is working for them. So eventually people become bothered by this. And you know what? This is fine with early aristocracies, because everyone in a young society, or everyone in an early aristocracies, seems to know their place. Those who are part of the working class have no delusions that they are qualified to rule. And because of that, there is really no attempts to challenge the ruling class. However, as the society begins to grow old, the people in different classes lose touch with their, I don't want to say social responsibility, but they lose touch with why their society is structured the way that it's structured. The aristocratic class becomes more arrogant and less tolerable to be ruled by, which eventually causes the other classes to grow restless and make them think that they could do a better job at ruling. So in order to keep order in the society, in order to keep people from rebelling or abandoning the city, and to raise the social morale a little bit, they changed the constitution to open up positions in government to landowners. And this is what begins to drive people to worship the virtues associated with timocracies. And those virtues are mostly like power and wealth-seeking or honor-seeking. Now, another reason why an aristocracy probably becomes a timocracy, another possibility, is that the club makes this change to the constitution to encourage the population to go to war and conquer foreign lands, because then it becomes possible for them to become landowners and governors. And by this, what I mean is, for those who don't know, in a timocracy is a form of government in which possession of property is required to hold office. And this is actually Aristotle's definition, and Plato's definition is a form of government in which rulers are motivated by ambition or love of honor. Now, of course, Plato, he just jacks it all up. Plato, he was really just a total sophist. People don't even realize this, but he was a total sophist with a lot of the things that he said. And what's really going on here with this motivated by ambition, this means motivated by seeking more power. And essentially what happens in this democracy, what's possible, is that the aristocrats, they realize that they need more land in their society. So they're like, okay, you know what? We need to go from being philosopher kings, who aren't about conquering foreign lands. We need to now change up our social order. We need to change the psychology of the people in our society. And we need to go from philosopher kings to basically being land conquerors. And this does a number of things, as I said. It opens up the ruling class to landowners, which gives this delusion to the masses that if they acquire land, then they can also acquire power. And this is where, like, the love of wealth starts to become associated with power, or this is where people start to love wealth or to love things that aren't really virtuous anymore. They prefer wealth and power over real virtues. And it's because the real virtues are no longer associated with power. They're no longer associated with the ruling class. And really, this is sort of, I've been wanting to make a video about the whole as above, so below philosophy. And this is a philosophy of the cult, of the club, of Satanists. And basically, this as above, so below philosophy, it actually is applying to this. It's applying to society. And what they're really saying is that when you change the people in the higher classes, when their attitude changes, it actually changes the minds of the lower classes. And they do that today with celebrities. And this is why celebrities are called stars. You know, stars which are found in the sky, the things above. They're called stars, and then when those celebrities act ridiculous and they change, like, you know, their kind of their philosophy, or when they change their culture, it affects actually the psychology and the culture of the masses. And that's what's really going on here. It's sort of a psychological operation. But that's not important for right now. For now, let's look at what else is said about democracies. A democracy, in choosing its leaders, is inclining rather to the more high-spirited and simple-minded type, who are better suited for war. The governors of democracy value power, which they seek to attain primarily by means of military conquest and the acquisition of honors, rather than intellectual means. You know, the acquisition of honors, just think about the Predator. It's like, yeah, I gotta look at this honor. Yeah, I got the skulls or the heads of my enemies. That's what is really being talked about here, but they refer to it as the acquisition of honors rather than intellectual means. And of course, this applies to the masses too. If a commoner, if a person in the lower classes acquires enough honor in a war, then they can move up the ranks and they can acquire land. And once again, this plays into the whole manipulation of the masses. Plato characterizes democracies as a mixture of the element of two different regime types, aristocracy and oligarchy. Just like the leaders of Platonic aristocracies, democratic governors will apply great effort in gymnastics and the arts of war, as well as the virtues that pertains to them, that of courage. They will also be contemptuous towards manual activities and trade, and will lead a life in public communion. Just like oligarchs, however, they will yearn for material wealth, and they will not trust thinkers to be placed in positions of power. Timocrats will have a tendency to accumulate wealth in pernicious ways, and hide their possessions from public view. They will also be spendthrift and hedonistic. Because their voluptuous nature will not be, like that of philosopher kings, pacified in a philosophical education, law can only be imposed onto them by means of force. Now, of course, the reason why timocratic rulers are not supposed to be wise is because a wise leader creates wise subjects, and for the most part, the club doesn't want this stage of their society to be wise. They want them to be power-hungry so that they can be used to conquer foreign lands. let's quickly move on to the last thing that is said about a democracy. Now let's quickly see the last thing that is said about democracies. And don't worry, I'm not going to read like every single thing about every single regime. I think democracy will be the last regime that I kind of read a lot of what Wikipedia says about them. But anyway, for Plato, democracies were clearly superior to most regimes that prevailed in Greece in his time, which were mostly oligarchies or democracies. Crete and Sparta are two examples of democracies given in Plato's Republic. In the Symposium, Sparta's founder, Lycurgus, is given high praise for his wisdom, and both Crete and Sparta continued to be held in admiration by Plato in one of his latest works, The Laws, for having constitutions which, unlike that of most other Greek cities, go beyond mere enumeration of laws, and focus instead on the cultivation of virtues, or at least one of them, that of courage. Plato, however, does present a criticism against those cities, that their constitutions neglected two other virtues essential to a perfectly just city such as his aristocracy, namely wisdom and moderation. Now, of course, the democracy would encourage courage and not wisdom and moderation because, once again, they're just trying to go to war to conquer foreign lands, to basically increase the size of their society. Now, let's take a quick look at what Plato said about oligarchies. So, Plato defines oligarchy as a system of government which distinguishes between the rich and the poor, making out of the former its administrators. Now, I just want to quickly say, it's very interesting that although oligarchies distinguish between the rich and the poor, even the aristocracies distinguishes between the excellent and the not so excellent. So that's also something that eventually causes the end of the aristocracy, is this division amongst the society. An oligarchy is originated by extending tendencies already evident in a democracy. In contrast to Platonic aristocrats, Timocrats are allowed by their constitution to own property, and thus to both accumulate and waste money. Because of the pleasures derived therefore, money eventually is prized over virtue, and the leaders of the state seek to alter the law to give way and accommodate to the materialistic lust of its citizens. As a result of this newfound appreciation for money, the governors rework the constitution yet again to restrict political power to the rich only. That is how a democracy becomes an oligarchy. Now, once again, Plato totally fucks things up. He makes it like the constitutions are changed to fit the desires and ideas of the ruling class, which isn't at all the case. What really causes the change is the same thing that causes the change from aristocracy to democracy. The leaders have to change the constitution to appease and manipulate the masses. This is why this change really occurs. It has to do with the manipulation of the working classes. The people that the original aristocrats called in to help, they have to make sure that they can manipulate them as the society goes on. And this is one of their forms of manipulations. The masses grow restless from being ruled by Timocrats. The masses grow restless from being ruled by Timocrats. And not only do they grow restless from being ruled by Timocrats, but eventually there's no more foreign lands to conquer, or conquering foreign lands becomes too difficult. So they need this new gimmick. So in order to boost social morale and to re-energize the masses, the rulers tell them that they can be rulers too if they accumulate wealth. Now this drives the masses to work even harder in hopes that they can become rulers themselves. And it drives society to worship money over virtues, especially since many virtues make it harder to make money because they make it harder to take advantage of people. So this is what's really going on here. Now, because the video is pretty long, I'm going to just skip what Wikipedia says about the type of man that exists in an oligarchy, and I'm just going to jump right into what is said about democracy. So let's go right into democracy here. Oligarchy then degenerates into a democracy, where freedom is the supreme good, but freedom is also slavery. In democracy, the lower class grows bigger and bigger. The poor become the winners. People are free to do what they want and live how they want. People can break the law if they so choose. This appears to be very similar to anarchy. Plato uses the democratic man to represent democracy. The democratic man is the son of the oligarch man. Unlike his father, the democratic man is consumed with unnecessary desires. Plato describes necessary desires as desires that we have out of instinct or desires that we have to survive. Unnecessary desires are desires that we can teach ourselves to resist, such as the desire for riches. The democratic man takes great interest in all the things he can buy with his money. Plato believes that the democratic man is more concerned with his money than he is concerned with how to help the people. He does whatever he wants whenever he wants to do it. His life has no order or priority. Now, of course, just like the previous regimes, oligarchy degenerates into democracy in order to try to address the problems the masses begin to have with the oligarchies. The oligarchs prove themselves to be unworthy leaders, and not only do they prove themselves to be unworthy leaders, but really there can only be so much wealth amassed in a society. Not everyone in society can live like a king. There just isn't enough resources for that. So eventually, the masses begin to demand that they be involved in government too. They demand that some change be made to the Constitution to increase social mobility. And this actually brings to mind what Plato was saying about the democratic man and his being consumed with unnecessary desires. Not only is the democratic man consumed with unnecessary desires, he's consumed with unrealistic desires. He becomes narcissistic, not realizing that he's not fit for certain things. The democratic man, not being qualified whatsoever, still believes that he is qualified to rule. Now, of course, this is almost always done in a half-assed manner, like through a representative democracy, or a democracy where only a certain segment of the population can vote. But really, all democracies are just liberal oligarchies with the illusion of choice. That's all it really is. Those who get elected to power are almost always part of the oligarchical class, and those who are doing the voting are almost always totally brainwashed by the oligarchical class. So, democracy is just, it's a complete illusion. However, mostly everything else Plato said is correct. Everything else Plato says, what he says about the democratic man, he just wants to do whatever he wants whenever he wants to do it. His life has no priority or order. This is correct. And Plato is also right to compare democracies to anarchy. Because technically, certain democracies can become like an anarchy. See, anarchists say that anarchy means without rulers. Well, technically, if you make it so that everyone can be a ruler, or that everyone is a ruler, everyone has a say in what's going on in the ruling classes or in government, if everyone has a say, well then technically nobody has a say. And technically it becomes a state of anarchy, where there are no rules, there are no standards, and it just becomes a mess. Well, to be much clearer than I'm being, what really happens is the state becomes impossibly big as it tries to accommodate everyone's rules. Society becomes hyper-bureaucratized, and as it becomes more and more bureaucratized, as it tries to accommodate more and more people's rules, society becomes less free. And I believe this is what Plato means by freedom is slavery, or freedom becomes equated with slavery. Actually, it becomes equated with slavery later on. As democracy descends into tyranny, this is sort of an excuse that's given. People start to reject freedom. Freedom basically develops a bad rep. And anyway, before that happens, this whole happening causes people to reject society. But anyway, this whole process causes people to reject society and makes people antisocial. and this eventually causes people to reject all other rulers and desire to be their own rulers, even if it means, their kingdom is a patch of dirt and their sense of control is derived from taking drugs. And that's exactly what happens, and that is actually exactly what happens right now. People begin to reject society and social rules and laws, and you get true anarchy. And we're sort of going through that process right now. As society becomes, or as society strives to become more free, supposedly quote-unquote more free, it actually ends up becoming less free. But this isn't an accident. This is all the club's doing. This is all the product, or this is all because of this corruption. And not just this corruption, but this intentional social manipulation. And, there's different layers to it. Like, I'm sure that there are certain layers of the club that don't realize this. Like, they don't realize that there's actually a hidden hand that's playing into all of this social decay. And what ends up happening is this level of the club that doesn't really know that the club has a hand in all of this, they actually begin to hate the general masses. Like, one level of the club, they blame the masses for all of this. They're like, oh, all of this is because we have to accommodate the masses who lose touch with why they're here in society. Like, this one layer of the club, it sees the masses as like basically the outside help. It's like, they only brought these people in to help with their work. They didn't bring them in to rule the society. And, this level of the club, that's why they can do some of the horrible things that they do, because they view the masses basically as like a disease or a plague, as if it's entirely the masses' fault, when really it's all this hidden hand, and it's all, there's a lot of facets to it. So now let's see what Plato has to say about the tyrant, or what Plato has to say about tyranny. Democracy then degenerates into tyranny, where no one has discipline and society exists in chaos. Democracy is taken over by the longing for freedom. Power must be seized to maintain order. A champion will come along and experience power, which will cause him to become a tyrant. The people will start to hate him, and eventually try to remove him, but will realize they are not able. The tyrannical man is the son of the democratic man. He is the worst form of man due to his being the most unjust, and thus the furthest removed from any joy of the true kind. He is consumed by lawless desires, which cause him to do many terrible things, such as murdering and plundering. He comes closest to complete lawlessness. The idea of moderation does not exist to him. He is consumed by the basest pleasures in life, and being granted these pleasures at a whim destroys the type of pleasure only attainable through knowing pain. If he spends all of his money and becomes poor, the tyrant will steal and conquer to satiate his desires, but will eventually overreach and force onto himself a fear of those around him, effectively limiting his own freedom. The tyrant always runs the risk of being killed in revenge for all the unjust things he has done. He becomes afraid to leave his own home and becomes trapped inside. Therefore, his lawlessness leads to his own self-imprisonment. So just like the previous changes in government, this change in government happens in order to address the problems that arise from the previous regime. The democracy puts the tyrant into power because they believe it is necessary in order to fix the problems that they believe are created by the democracy. And he doesn't start as a tyrant. He is sold to the public as a champion. And either the power the tyrant receives corrupts them, or they were corrupt the whole time and were really just a giant ruse. The tyrant could also just be this corrupt person. So that's one of two things that happens. Either the power that he receives corrupts him, or her, or they were a plant the whole time and they were corrupt the whole time. But in either case, what ends up happening, or at least historically what has ended up happening, is the tyrant ends up turning on the people, and the tyrant ends up taking care of what the club believes is the real problem, which is the masses. You see, the problem is really caused by corrupt politicians, but the tyrant almost always ends up making it as if the problem is with the masses and with the tyrant's political opposition. And of course, the tyrant's political opposition is almost always politicians or other maybe influencers who obtained power during the democracy, like during the democracy regime. So this tyrant, he ends up turning the society back into the aristocracy. He basically comes in and he cleans house. He basically comes in and he hits the reset button. He has to reset all of the mental manipulation, and he basically restarts society back as an aristocracy, or at least after the tyrant, what comes out of that is an aristocracy. And by this, I mean really that the tyrant, or maybe those who overthrow the tyrant, I actually think it's the tyrant, returns society back to willfully giving themselves to the state. Because that's what an aristocracy really is. If you really look at an aristocracy, it's when people are willingly giving themselves to the state. If you have a political spectrum, an aristocracies is when people are willingly giving themselves to the state for whatever reason, whether they believe the state is divine, or they believe the state has access to some special philosophical knowledge that will bring them enlightenment, or if they believe the state will provide them, or if they believe the state will provide them shelter from the chaos that exists in the natural world. You know, these are some of the reasons why people willingly give themselves to these aristocracies. And on the opposite side of that spectrum is anarchy, where everyone rejects the state. And the whole thing is basically just repeated with some slight variation. Like, for example, as I said before, the first aristocracies had kings that were believed to be gods, like in ancient Egypt. You know, the aristocrats, way back then, they had a special knowledge of astronomy, and they used that special knowledge of astronomy to convince people that they were gods. But the second set were kings that are believed to be great philosophers who know what is really right. Then after that whole set, after Plato's whole set of philosopher kings, after that came to an end, it sort of came back to the religious aristocracy again. But instead of the aristocratic class being known as gods, they were said to be like of divine origin. Like it was said that they had a divine right to rule because of like their lineage to like some other asshole or another. So these are all of the turnings. So really, when you look at how many times society has went through these 5 regimes, it's actually gone through these 5 regimes several times. Like, I can think of 3 different times it's gone through these 5 regimes, and I think right now we're seeing the end, or we're living through the end of the 4th cycle. And soon we will have a tyrant, but that tyrant will be a total shill. This tyrant will not actually be the people's champion. So this is what I believe needs to happen. Actually, first let me kind of really emphasize what's going to happen. The club is going to continue to tear apart the fabric of society. They are going to continue to push people to the edge until eventually there is a breaking point and the people will demand some sort of tyrant. Or what's going to happen is the people are going to push so far towards one side of the political spectrum. Like, what's going to happen, at least what I believe they're trying to get rid of liberalism. I have another video about the end of liberalism. So what I believe is going to happen, and this is actually what happens historically, this is what causes the anarchy. People have to reject extreme freedom and demand basically their own enslavement or their own tyrants. So what's going to happen is we're going to swing very extremely to one side of the political spectrum, eventually, after all of this political turmoil that we're currently going through. Eventually, we're going to end in a tyranny. Maybe not an individual tyrant like people associate most tyrannies with. It could be a constitutional tyranny. Like, people don't realize this, but the Anti-Federalists argued that the Constitution actually creates a government that has more power than the King of England had at the time of the colonial era. And they argued that if a faction were to take over the three branches of government, the government could essentially have unlimited power, especially when you focus on the preamble of the Constitution and understand how the preamble of the Constitution allows the government to violate any of your rights. So that's probably what's going to happen. This is almost guaranteed. I think everyone already sees this on the horizon. We are going to get pushed into the corner, artificially so, into asking for our own tyrant. However, as I said, this tyrant is going to be a shill. And what's going to happen is, this tyrant is basically going to start the entire cycle over. They're going to create a system that promises the masses probably security and safety from chaos, and it'll probably be something very similar to what happened in the Starship Troopers universe. Unfortunately, I deleted my video about the Starship Troopers universe. A while ago, I had a video responding to Sargon of Akkad's analysis of Starship Troopers, and basically in that video, I showed that Sargon of Akkad is a shill who was reading off of a script, who doesn't know anything about the Starship Troopers universe, and he was basically selling people a lie in his video. I had broken down everything about the Starship Troopers universe, and I explained in great detail how the Starship Troopers universe is actually a political nightmare. And I had to do this because Sargon of Akkad was making it as if the Starship Troopers universe was the greatest thing ever. And really, a lot of people will be convinced of that because of the social manipulation that's going on. But we need to get ahead of them. By being aware of this, we need to get ahead of them, and we need to choose a true people's champion. We need to choose our own champion. We need to choose our own tyrant that will deal with the problems that are really at hand, that will deal with the corruption that has been plaguing us for a very long time. This very deep-rooted corruption that I believe goes back to thousands of years. The same group, this same cult, has been doing the same thing for thousands of years, since at least ancient Egypt. Like I said, this is their fourth cycle of doing this. And our tyrant, our people's champion that we choose, is not to bring about some new aristocracy with some philosopher kings. No, we need to bring an entirely new system of government. And this is the second solution that I'm working on. At the start of this video, I said that I'm thinking about two solutions, or I've thought about two solutions. And essentially, the other solution is a new system of government. Now, this new system of government doesn't necessarily need to be brought in with a typical tyrant. Maybe we can use our current system. Maybe we can use this current democratic republic that we have to bring about this new system, but I'm not counting on it because of the amount of corruption that we have. Because there's this wall of corruption that would make it nearly impossible to draft a new constitution for this country, there's really no other way but making sure that at that point, when they're trying to give us a tyrant, we stand up and we say, no, we're not taking your tyrant, we're taking our own tyrant, we're taking our true people's champion. And essentially, I believe that this is actually the Jesus Christ figure. I believe that this is actually the biblical Christ that is supposed to be coming back, is this figure, the true people's champion. He's supposed to come and not create a new system of aristocracy, but create an entirely new system of government, which I'm trying to work on. It's kind of difficult. I'm trying to work out the kinks, because I think that our current system is close. We're very close to having a very good system of government, but there are certain kinks in it that I'm trying to work out in terms of how to prevent this level of corruption that we are facing. Now, of course, term limits help with that. Of course, a more clear Bill of Rights would have helped with that, so we really only need to make minor changes. And essentially, I'll give you guys a little insight into what I'm trying to do, just in case if I die, maybe somebody can pick up from where I left off. What has to be done is this new system of government has to reflect the ideas that are found in the Declaration of Independence. And it has to reflect the ideas that are found in the Declaration of Independence for a couple of reasons. One, because the ideas found in the Declaration of Independence are really fucking good ideas. They're ideas that we cannot lose. We cannot let that be taken from us. The other reason why it needs to reflect the ideas found in the Declaration of Independence is because it will bring a more legitimacy to this new system of government. By having it reflect the ideas found in the Declaration of Independence, which is this nation's founding document, you can claim that this new system of government better captures the spirit of the Founding Fathers, and is thus a more justified system of government. The result of this tendency will be fatal. Spontaneous social action will be broken up over and over again by state intervention. No new seed will be able to fructify. Society will have to live for the state, man for the governmental machine. And as, after all, it is only a machine whose existence and maintenance depends on the vital supports around it, the state, after sucking out the very marrow of society, will be left bloodless, a skeleton dead with that rusty death of machinery, more gruesome than the death of a living organism. Is the paradoxical, tragic process of statism now realized? Society, that it may live better, creates the state as an instrument. Then the state gets the upper hand, and society has to begin to live for the state. But for all that, the state is still composed of the members of that society. But soon these do not suffice to support it, and it has to call in foreigners. First Dalmatians, then Germans. These foreigners take possession of the state, and the rest of society, the former populace, has to live as their slaves. Slaves of people with whom they have nothing in common. This is what state intervention leads to. The people are converted into fuel to feed the mere machine, which is the state. The skeleton eats up the flesh around it. The scaffolding becomes the owner and tenant of the house.
The world has become a pussy-whipped, Brady Bunch version of itself, run by a bunch of robed sissies.
If not now, when?